I found the discrepancy on a Tuesday night while my wife was putting our daughter to bed, hunched over my laptop at the kitchen table with a lukewarm cup of coffee and a growing sense that something was very, very wrong with our water bill. The numbers didn't add up. They hadn't added up for months, actually, but I'd been too busy with work to really dig into it. We lived in Maple Ridge Estates, a planned community in Scottsdale, Arizona, with precisely maintained lawns, identical mailboxes, and an HOA that seemed to have an opinion about everything from the exact shade of beige you could paint your shutters to how many potted plants constituted a garden display. Our HOA president, Patricia Moreland, was exactly the kind of woman you'd expect in that role. Mid-50s, with that specific haircut that seemed to be a prerequisite for the position, always dressed in pastel cardigans, and possessing an uncanny ability to appear whenever someone's trash cans were visible from the street past 8 a.m. on collection day. But this wasn't about trash cans or paint colors. This was about money. I'd pulled up our water bills for the past year, and I'd also done something I should have done months ago. I looked at the actual rate structure from the city of Scottsdale. According to the city's website, water in our area cost approximately $3.42 per 100 cubic feet, plus a base service charge of $18.50 per month. Our household, with 2 adults, 1 7-year-old, and admittedly my tendency to take longer showers than I should, typically used about 600 cubic feet per month. By my math, our monthly water bill should have been somewhere around $39 to $42, our actual bills. Averaging $67 per month, I sat back staring at the screen. That was a difference of roughly $25 to $28 per month. Over a year, we were talking about an extra $300 to $336, and we'd been living here for 3 years. The billing company listed on our statements wasn't the city of Scottsdale. It was something called Clearwater Utility Services, LLC. I'd never really paid attention to that detail before. Most people don't scrutinize their utility bills that closely, right? You just pay them and move on with your life. But I'd been going through our household budget because we were thinking about putting in a pool, and I wanted to see where we could trim expenses. I opened a new browser tab and searched for Clearwater Utility Services. The website was professional-looking but oddly vague. It claimed to be a comprehensive utility management solutions provider that worked with planned communities across Arizona and Nevada. There were stock photos of smiling families and pristine suburban neighborhoods. But there was something missing: any actual information about rates, fee structures, or how their pricing worked. I dug deeper. The company was registered with the Arizona Corporation Commission. I found their filing documents online. Arizona's ACC database is public, thankfully. Clearwater Utility Services, LLC had been formed in 2019, just a year before we'd moved into Maple Ridge Estates. The registered agent was a law firm in Phoenix. The listed members of the LLC were harder to track down, hidden behind layers of corporate structure that made my head spin. Then I found something interesting. Buried in the HOA's annual budget documents, which I had to request through the management company and which arrived in my email as a barely readable scanned PDF. There was a line item showing that the HOA received a utility administration fee from Clearwater Utility Services. The amount, $47,000 annually. I did some quick math. Maple Ridge Estates had 284 homes. If the HOA was receiving $47,000 per year, that worked out to about $165 per household annually, or roughly $14 per month per home. But if households were being overcharged by $25 to $28 per month on average, that meant Clearwater was collecting around $7,100 to $7,952 extra per month from the entire community. or $85,200 to $95,424 per year. They were paying the HOA $47,000 and pocketing the rest. My coffee had gone cold. I barely noticed. I needed to understand the ownership structure of Clearwater Utility Services. That took another hour of digging through public records, cross-referencing business addresses, and following breadcrumbs through corporate filings. What I found made my stomach turn. Clearwater Utility Services, LLC, was wholly owned by a holding company called Desert Property Solutions, Inc. and Desert Property Solutions, Inc. listed 3 primary officers: Patricia Moreland, her husband Richard Moreland, and a man named James Vickers, who I recognized as a member of the HOA board. Patricia Moreland, our HOA president, was routing our water bills through a company she owned, marking them up by approximately 40%, and then having that company pay the HOA an administration fee that helped justify the arrangement while she and her business partners pocketed the difference. This wasn't just aggressive billing. This was fraud. I sat there for a long moment, listening to my wife's voice drifting down from upstairs, reading our daughter a bedtime story. We'd moved to Maple Ridge Estates because it seemed safe, well-maintained, and like a good place to raise a kid. We'd paid our dues, followed the rules, kept our grass at the regulation height, and never once questioned the authority of the HOA, and we'd been getting robbed the entire time. I needed to be careful about this. Patricia Moreland wasn't just the HOA president, she was connected. Her husband was a real estate developer with projects all over the Phoenix metro area. James Vickers was an attorney. These weren't people who would take kindly to being exposed, and they certainly had more resources than I did for a legal fight. But I couldn't just let this go. It wasn't just about my money. It was about every family in this neighborhood who was being systematically overcharged for a basic utility, and who had no idea that the person they'd elected to represent their interests was actively exploiting them. The next morning, I made a list. I needed documentation, I needed allies, and I needed to understand the legal framework well enough to know what laws were being broken. I worked from home 3 days a week as a software engineer for a logistics company, which gave me flexibility. I decided to use that flexibility to become very well informed about utility billing fraud. First, I requested historical water usage data from the city of Scottsdale for our address. Under Arizona law, residents have the right to access this information. It took 3 phone calls and being transferred 4 times, but I finally got connected to someone in the Water Services Department who could help me. "I'm trying to reconcile some billing," I told the clerk, a woman named Sandra who sounded like she'd been doing this job for approximately 1,000 years and had heard every possible customer complaint. "What's your account number?" she asked. "That's the thing," I said. "I don't think we have a direct account with the city. Our community goes through a management company." There was a pause. "What's your address?" I gave it to her. I heard typing. "Okay, so you're in Maple Ridge Estates," Sandra said. "Right, that's a bulk service account. The HOA has the master account with us, and then they handle billing to individual residents." "Is that common?" "Fairly common in planned communities," Sandra said. "Especially newer ones. The HOA buys the water from us at the master meter, then subdivides it out to individual properties. Legally, they're only supposed to pass through the actual cost plus any reasonable administrative fees. We provide the usage data to the HOA monthly." "What would constitute a reasonable administrative fee?" Sandra hesitated. "I'm not really supposed to give advice on that. But generally, we're talking about the actual cost of processing the billing, maintaining the submeters if they exist, that kind of thing. Maybe a few dollars per household per month. Why do you ask?" "Just trying to understand my bill," I said. "Could I get copies of the master meter readings for the community for the past year?" "Those go to the HOA," Sandra said. but you can file a public records request for them. You're entitled to know the rates we charge the master account. I filed the public records request that afternoon. Arizona's public records law requires responses within a reasonable time frame, usually interpreted as about 5 business days for straightforward requests. While I waited, I did something else. I started talking to neighbors, carefully. I didn't want word getting back to Patricia before I had all my documentation in order, but I needed to know if other people had noticed the same discrepancies. My next-door neighbor, Tom Hernandez, was a high school teacher who I'd occasionally share a beer with on weekends. I caught him washing his car on Saturday morning. "Hey Tom, weird question," I said, walking over with my own coffee. "Have you ever looked closely at your water bill?" Tom straightened up, squeegee in hand. "Can't say that I have. Why?" "Just seems high to me. I was curious if you thought yours was expensive." He shrugged. "I mean, yeah, utilities here aren't cheap, but that's Arizona, right? Water's always going to cost more in the desert. How much are you paying for water specifically?" He thought about it. "Maybe $65–70 a month, something like that." Tom's household was just him and his wife. They should have been using significantly less water than my family. "Doesn't that seem steep, is it? I don't really have a comparison." This is our first house. And that was the problem, I realized. Most people in the neighborhood were either first-time homebuyers or had moved from other states. They didn't know what water should cost in Scottsdale. They just paid the bill and assumed it was normal. I tried a different approach. "Do you know what company actually bills us for water?" "Like who you make the check out to?" Clearwater something. Clearwater Utility. It's auto-pay for me, honestly." "Did you know Patricia Moreland owns that company?" That got his attention. "Our HOA president?" "Yeah, she and her husband and James Vickers from the board." Tom frowned. "Is that allowed?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." By the time I'd talked to a half-dozen neighbors over the next week, a picture emerged. Everyone was paying between $60 and $75 per month for water, regardless of household size or usage. A retired couple 3 houses down was paying nearly the same amount as a family of 5 across the street. That didn't make sense if the billing was actually based on usage. The public records came back from the city of Scottsdale on the following Wednesday. I opened the email attachment with my heart pounding. The master meter data was revelatory. For the most recent month I had data for, the entire Maple Ridge Estates community had used 184,300 cubic feet of water. The city had charged the HOA's master account $6,484.26 for that usage, including all base fees and service charges. I pulled up that month's bills from as many neighbors as I could get information from. Between my own digging and what people had shared with me, I had data from about 40 households. Those 40 households had been billed a total of $2,703 for water by Clearwater Utility Services that month. If that was representative of the whole community, 40 houses being about 14% of the total, then Clearwater had billed residents approximately $19,307 that month for water that had cost $6,484.26 from the city. That was a markup of nearly 200%. My initial estimate of 40% had been conservative. This was so much worse. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the numbers, feeling physically sick. This wasn't just a few extra dollars. This was systematic, large-scale theft from nearly 300 families. I needed legal advice. I couldn't afford to just hire a lawyer on my own, but I could at least consult with one. I found a consumer protection attorney in Phoenix named Rebecca Chen who offered free initial consultations. I drove to her office on a Thursday afternoon, taking a late lunch from work. Rebecca Chen's office was in a modest building in downtown Phoenix, sandwiched between a bail bonds place and a tax preparation service. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe late 30s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I laid out everything I'd found: the ownership structure of Clearwater Utility Services, the markup on the water bills, the kickback to the HOA in the form of the utility administration fee, and the master meter data from the city. Rebecca listened, taking notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she sat back and tapped her pen against the pad. "This is fraud," she said simply. "Probably several kinds of fraud, actually. Wire fraud if they're using electronic payments. Breach of fiduciary duty, since HOA board members are fiduciaries to the homeowners. Potentially racketeering, depending on how widespread this is and whether they're doing it in other communities. What can I do about it? Few options. You could file a complaint with the Arizona Corporation Commission. You could file a civil lawsuit against the HOA and Clearwater Utility Services. You could report it to law enforcement. The Arizona Attorney General's office has a consumer protection division that handles this kind of thing, or all of the above. What would you recommend?" Rebecca considered. "Honestly, if the numbers are as bad as you're saying, this is criminal. I'd start with the Attorney General's office and consider a class action civil suit. You're going to want criminal charges to apply pressure, and you're going to want a civil case to get people's money back. How much would a class action cost?" Most consumer protection attorneys, myself included, would take something like this on contingency. We get paid a percentage of the settlement or judgment. The question is whether you can get other residents on board. These cases require a class representative, someone willing to be the public face of the lawsuit. That person tends to take some heat. I thought about Patricia Moreland, about her husband's connections, about James Vickers being an attorney. What kind of heat? Retaliation, harassment, legal threats. Countersuits sometimes, although those rarely go anywhere. The law protects whistleblowers, but that doesn't mean it's fun. She leaned forward. "Look, Mr. Harrison, I'll be straight with you. This is a strong case if your documentation is solid, but you need to be sure you want to start this fight. These people clearly have resources and no ethical qualms about screwing their neighbors. They're not going to go down easy. I thought about my daughter, about the principle of the thing, about 300 families being robbed. I'm sure." Rebecca nodded. "Then let's start by filing a complaint with the AG's office. I can help you prepare that. Meanwhile, you need to gather more evidence and more neighbors. You want this to be airtight before it goes public." Over the next 2 weeks, I became a man obsessed. I created spreadsheets comparing city water rates to what Clearwater charged. I documented the corporate ownership structure in a flowchart. I filed an open records request with the HOA itself, demanding copies of all contracts between the HOA and Clearwater Utility Services, all financial records related to water billing, and the minutes from board meetings where the arrangement had been approved. The HOA's management company responded to my request with a letter saying they'd provide the documents within 30 days as required by Arizona law, but there would be a $147 processing fee for copying and staff time. I paid it, furious but knowing I needed the documents. I also started attending HOA board meetings. These were held on the first Tuesday of each month in the community clubhouse, and they were typically sparsely attended. Most homeowners didn't care about HOA politics until the HOA did something that directly affected them. The March meeting had maybe 12 residents in attendance, plus the 5 board members. Patricia Moreland sat at the center of the long table at the front of the room, flanked by James Vickers and 3 other board members I knew less well: Susan Chen, Robert Maxwell, and Deanna Torres. Patricia had that specific HOA president energy, the kind of officious, self-important air of someone who took their volunteer position way too seriously. She called the meeting to order, and they went through the standard agenda. Approval of last month's minutes, financial report, landscaping update, architectural review committee report. During the financial report, I raised my hand. Patricia looked at me with the expression of someone who just discovered gum on her shoe. Yes, Mr. Harrison. I have a question about the utility expenses, I said, keeping my voice level. I noticed we pay a company called Clearwater Utility Services for water billing. Can you explain how that arrangement works? There was the briefest flicker of something across Patricia's face, annoyance maybe, or wariness, but she smoothed it over quickly. Clearwater Utility Services provides billing administration for our water system. They handle the metering, the billing, the collections, and customer service. It's a standard arrangement. What's the cost structure? How much do they charge for this service? That's detailed in our annual budget, which is available to all homeowners. I've reviewed the budget. It shows the HOA receives a fee from Clearwater, but it doesn't show what Clearwater charges residents relative to what we pay the city for water. James Vickers leaned forward. He had silver hair and the kind of commanding presence you'd expect from a litigator. Mr. Harrison, is it? The HOA's financial obligations are to ensure that water service is provided reliably and that the costs are covered. The specific arrangements with our vendors are part of our operational management. Are board members required to disclose conflicts of interest? The room got very quiet. Patricia's smile could have cut glass. I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm asking a general question about HOA governance. Arizona law requires board members to disclose conflicts of interest, correct? If you have a specific concern, Mr. Harrison, you're welcome to submit it in writing to the board, Patricia said, her tone making it clear the discussion was over. We'll move on to the landscaping update. I didn't push it further. I'd made my point. I was paying attention, and I wasn't going away. After the meeting, a few residents approached me in the parking lot. One was a woman named Maria Santos who lived over in the western section of the community. What was that about? She asked. The water billing thing. Do you think your water bill is high? I asked. I mean, yes, but isn't everyone's? It might be higher than it should be. How would you feel about comparing notes? I'm looking into some discrepancies. Maria glanced back toward the clubhouse, where Patricia and James were standing by Patricia's Mercedes, talking intently. You think something shady is going on? I think it's worth investigating. She nodded slowly. My husband and I have been struggling with the bills here. Between the HOA dues and the utilities, it's way more than we budgeted for. If something's wrong, I want to know about it. I got Maria's email and phone number. I also connected with two other residents who'd overheard, David Park and Jennifer Wu, a married couple who were both accountants. When I mentioned I had data suggesting the water bills were inflated, David's professional interest was immediately piqued. How inflated? He asked. Potentially double or triple what they should be, Jennifer whistled. That's not a billing error, that's theft. That's what I think too. By early April, I had a coalition of about 20 households who were actively working with me. David and Jennifer had taken point on the financial analysis, creating detailed models comparing what the city charged for water versus what Clearwater charged us. Maria had started a private Facebook group where we shared information and strategy. Another neighbor, a paralegal named Aaron Mitchell, had started researching Arizona HOA law and consumer protection statutes. The documents from my open records request arrived in mid-April, delivered in a large manila envelope. I spread them out on my dining room table: contracts, board meeting minutes, financial statements. The contract between Maple Ridge Estates HOA and Clearwater Utility Services was dated January 2020, signed by Patricia Moreland as HOA president. The terms were vague. stating that Clearwater would provide comprehensive water utility billing and management services in exchange for standard industry rates and an annual payment to the HOA for administrative overhead and system maintenance. What was conspicuously absent was any cap on what Clearwater could charge residents or any requirement that charges reflect actual costs. The board meeting minutes from December 2019, when the contract had been approved, were illuminating. The motion to engage Clearwater Utility Services had been made by James Vickers and seconded by Susan Chen. The vote was 4-1 in favor, with only one board member, someone named Richard Kwan, who was no longer on the board, voting against. According to the minutes, Richard Kwan had expressed concerns about potential conflicts of interest and lack of transparency in pricing. His objections had been noted and overruled. I searched for Richard Kwan. It took some digging, but I found him on LinkedIn. He'd moved to Seattle in 2021. I sent him a message explaining what I was investigating and asking if he'd be willing to talk. He responded within a day, "Call me." He included his phone number. I called him that evening from my garage, wanting privacy. "I wondered when someone would figure this out," Richard said when I explained what I'd found. His voice was tired, unsurprised. "I tried to stop it when I was on the board. I voted against the Clearwater contract. I raised concerns about Patricia's involvement. I even consulted with an attorney about whether it was legal." What did the attorney say? That it was a gray area. HOAs are allowed to contract with companies for services, even if board members have ownership stakes, as long as there's full disclosure and the terms are reasonable. The problem was that Patricia never made full disclosure. She presented Clearwater as an independent company. She didn't tell the board that she and her husband owned it. Did you confront her? I tried. She denied it at first, said I was mistaken. When I pushed, she said it was none of my business and threatened to sue me for defamation. James Vickers backed her up. He sent me a cease and desist letter on his firm's letterhead. I had 2 young kids and a mortgage. I couldn't afford a legal fight with an attorney, so I backed off. Eventually, I just resigned from the board and left the state. Would you be willing to provide a statement about this? Maybe testify if it comes to that. Richard was quiet for a moment. If you're really going after them, yeah, someone needs to. What they're doing is wrong, and they've been getting away with it because everyone's too intimidated to speak up. Armed with Richard's testimony and my growing file of evidence, I finalized my complaint to the Arizona Attorney General's office. Rebecca Chen helped me write it, and we filed it on April 22, 2025. The complaint was 47 pages, including exhibits, and it laid out the entire scheme. The undisclosed conflict of interest, the fraudulent billing, the breach of fiduciary duty, and the estimated financial harm to homeowners. We also filed a separate complaint with the Arizona Corporation Commission, which regulates utilities in the state, arguing that Clearwater Utility Services was operating as an unlicensed utility and engaging in fraudulent billing practices. Then we waited. In the meantime, Patricia Moreland was clearly aware that something was brewing. At the May HOA board meeting, she announced that there would be a comprehensive audit of all HOA finances by an independent accounting firm, and that the board was committed to transparency and accountability. It was a preemptive move, trying to control the narrative before the scandal broke publicly. But it was too late for that. The Arizona Attorney General's office contacted me in late May. I spoke with an investigator named Marcus Webb, a soft-spoken man who asked detailed, pointed questions about everything in my complaint. He requested copies of all my documentation, which I provided. He also asked for contact information for other affected homeowners who might be willing to cooperate with the investigation. "This is going to take time," Marcus told me. We need to verify everything, interview witnesses, subpoena records. But between you and me, what you've documented looks really bad. If it's accurate, people are going to face criminal charges. How long are we talking? Months, probably. These things don't move fast, but we'll be thorough. While the AG's investigation proceeded quietly, our neighborhood coalition was growing. By June, we had 53 households actively involved. We'd done the math. Collectively, we'd been overcharged by an estimated $142,000 over the course of the past 3 years. Rebecca Chen filed a class action lawsuit in Maricopa County Superior Court on June 15, 2025. The lawsuit named Patricia Moreland, Richard Moreland, James Vickers, Clearwater Utility Services LLC, Desert Property Solutions Inc., and the Maple Ridge Estates HOA as defendants. We were suing for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, unjust enrichment, and violations of the Arizona Consumer Fraud Act. The lawsuit became public record the moment it was filed. By that evening, it was the talk of the neighborhood. My phone started ringing. Some calls were supportive, neighbors wanting to join the lawsuit or offering information. But there were also angry calls. People who thought I was causing trouble, who believed Patricia's version of events, who worried that the lawsuit would harm property values or create divisions in the community. One woman, Carol Edmonds, called me a troublemaker and said I should mind my own business. When I pointed out that systematic fraud was everyone's business, she hung up on me. The next day, I received a letter from James Vickers' law firm. It was a cease and desist, claiming that I was making defamatory statements about Patricia Moreland and demanding that I stop spreading false information about Clearwater Utility Services. It threatened legal action if I didn't comply. I forwarded it to Rebecca Chen. "Standard intimidation tactic," she said when I called her, panicked. "They can't actually do anything to you. You're protected by anti-SLAPP laws and everything you've said is true and documented. Don't respond to them. Let me handle it." Rebecca sent a response that was a masterclass in legal courtesy wrapped around a core of steel. It politely explained that I was exercising my First Amendment rights and my rights under Arizona whistleblower protection laws, and that any attempt to sue me for speaking truthfully about matters of public concern would result in an immediate countersuit for malicious prosecution and abuse of process. We didn't hear back from Vickers' firm. The lawsuit and the AG investigation had another effect. The local media picked up the story. A reporter from the Arizona Republic named Lisa Tang contacted me in early July, asking if I'd be willing to talk about the case. I consulted with Rebecca. "It's your call," she said. "Media attention can help build public pressure, but it also means putting yourself out there publicly. You'll be the face of this." I thought about it for about 30 seconds. Let's do it. The article ran on July 12, 2025, on the front page of the Arizona Republic's local section. The headline was "Scottsdale HOA President Accused of Water Billing Fraud." It included interviews with me, with several other homeowners, and with consumer protection advocates. It also included a no comment from Patricia Moreland's attorney and a statement from the HOA's management company saying they were cooperating fully with all investigations. The article went viral locally. It was picked up by Phoenix TV stations. I did 2 television interviews, including one with the investigative team at the local NBC affiliate. The story resonated because everyone hates HOAs. Everyone hates feeling ripped off, and the idea of an HOA president systematically defrauding her own neighbors was too juicy to ignore. The public attention had an immediate effect on the Attorney General's investigation. Suddenly, with media scrutiny, the case became a priority. In late July, I was contacted by the AG's office and told that they were moving forward with criminal charges. On August 4, 2025, Patricia Moreland, Richard Moreland, and James Vickers were arrested and charged with fraud, theft, racketeering, and engaging in a pattern of criminal activity. The charges alleged that they had systematically defrauded homeowners in Maple Ridge Estates out of approximately $850,000 over a 5-year period. The arrests made the evening news. I watched the footage of Patricia being led out of her house in handcuffs, her face a mask of fury and humiliation, and I felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and sadness. This was justice, but it was also the spectacular collapse of someone's life, even if they'd brought it on themselves. The criminal case moved through the system over the next several months. All 3 defendants initially pled not guilty, and their attorneys filed motions to dismiss that were rejected. The evidence was overwhelming. The corporate records, the billing data from the city, testimony from Richard Kwan and dozens of homeowners, forensic accounting that showed exactly where the money had gone. In November, Richard Moreland took a plea deal. He agreed to testify against Patricia and James in exchange for reduced charges. His testimony was damning. He described in detail how the scheme had been set up, how Patricia had approached him with the idea in 2019, how they deliberately structured the ownership of Clearwater to obscure their involvement, and how they'd used the utility administration fee paid to the HOA to create a veneer of legitimacy. Faced with Richard's testimony, James Vickers also took a deal in December. That left Patricia standing alone. Her trial began in February 2026. I testified, as did David Park, Jennifer Wu, Maria Santos, Richard Kwan, and several others. The prosecution presented the financial evidence, the corporate records, and the testimony of her co-conspirators. Patricia's defense was essentially that she'd believed the arrangement was legal, that the rates charged by Clearwater were competitive with what other utility management companies charged, and that she'd been providing a legitimate service. Her attorneys tried to paint her as a well-meaning community volunteer who'd made some mistakes in judgment but hadn't intended to defraud anyone. The jury didn't buy it. On March 2, 2026, Patricia Moreland was convicted on all counts: fraud, theft, racketeering, and engaging in a criminal enterprise. The verdict was unanimous. Sentencing was scheduled for April. Meanwhile, the civil lawsuit was also moving forward. With the criminal convictions, the defendant's position in the civil case became untenable. Rebecca negotiated a settlement in mid-March. The terms, Clearwater Utility Services LLC and Desert Property Solutions Inc., would be dissolved. All assets would be liquidated. Patricia and Richard Moreland would be required to pay $1.2 million in restitution to affected homeowners, covering all overcharges plus interest and penalties. James Vickers would pay an additional $300,000. The insurance carrier for the HOA's directors and officers' liability policy would contribute $500,000. After attorney fees and expenses, each household that had been part of the class action would receive a check for approximately $4,800. Not quite full restitution for all the years we'd been overcharged, but substantial. More importantly, the HOA itself was reformed. The entire board was recalled in a special election. New bylaws were adopted requiring full disclosure of any conflicts of interest, mandatory competitive bidding for all contracts over $10,000, and quarterly financial transparency reports to all homeowners. The water billing was transferred to direct accounts with the city of Scottsdale, cutting out any middleman. Patricia Moreland's sentencing hearing was on April 14, 2026. I attended, sitting in the public gallery with Maria Santos, David and Jennifer, and several other neighbors who'd been part of the fight. The judge, a stern woman named Linda Martinez, heard statements from several victims before pronouncing sentence. Maria spoke about the financial strain the inflated bills had caused her family. David spoke about the betrayal of trust. I spoke about the principle that people in positions of authority have a responsibility to those they serve, not to enrich themselves at others' expense. Patricia's attorney asked for leniency, citing her previously clean record and her community service. Patricia herself made a brief statement, saying she was sorry for any harm caused, but maintaining that she'd believed she was acting properly. Judge Martinez was unimpressed. She sentenced Patricia Moreland to 6 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 4 years. She also ordered full restitution to all victims and a lifetime ban on serving in any fiduciary capacity, including on HOA boards. Richard Moreland and James Vickers, because of their plea deals and cooperation, received sentences of 3 years and 18 months respectively, both with significant probation periods afterward. As I left the courthouse that day, walking out into the bright Arizona sunshine, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: relief. It was over. The people who'd exploited their neighbors for years were being held accountable. The money was being returned. The system had been fixed. That evening, our neighborhood coalition, which had started as a handful of concerned residents and grown to encompass nearly a third of the community, held a celebration at the clubhouse. It wasn't exactly a party, it was more like a collective exhale. We'd been fighting for nearly a year and we'd won. Maria raised a glass of cheap champagne. "To paying attention to your water bill," she said, and everyone laughed. "To not backing down when something's wrong," David added. Jennifer looked at me. "To having the guts to be the first one to speak up." I shook my head. It wasn't just me, it took all of us, and that was true. I might have discovered the fraud, but it had taken a community to fight it. It had taken people willing to spend time documenting evidence, willing to speak to investigators, willing to testify in court, willing to stand up to intimidation and threats and social pressure. Over the next few weeks, life in Maple Ridge Estates slowly returned to normal. The new HOA board was competent and transparent. The direct billing from the city meant our water bills dropped to where they should have been all along. My family's went from $67 per month to $38. That extra $29 per month might not sound like much, but it added up. Over the course of a year, it was nearly $350 that stayed in our pockets instead of lining Patricia Moreland's. The settlement checks arrived in May. Mine was $4,847.33. I deposited it and then took my wife and daughter out for a nice dinner to celebrate. We never did put in that pool. The whole experience had made me cautious about big expenses and very attentive to our budget. But we did use some of the settlement money for a family vacation to San Diego that summer, something we'd been putting off for years. As I sat on the beach watching my daughter play in the waves, my wife reading a novel beside me, I thought about the whole ordeal. It had been stressful, time-consuming, and occasionally frightening. There had been moments when I'd questioned whether it was worth it, whether I should just let it go and not rock the boat. But I'd learned something important. Systems of power, even small ones like an HOA, rely on people not paying attention, not asking questions, not making trouble. Patricia Moreland had gotten away with her scheme for years, not because it was particularly sophisticated, but because nobody had bothered to check the numbers. Nobody had questioned why our bills seemed high. Nobody had thought to compare what we paid to what the city charged. She'd counted on apathy, and for a long time, she'd been right to count on it. The other thing I learned was that individuals have more power than they think. I was just a guy, a software engineer with no legal training and no particular expertise in utilities or fraud investigation. But I had a laptop, access to public records, and a willingness to spend my evenings digging through corporate filings and spreadsheets. That had been enough to uncover a fraud that had stolen nearly $1 million from my community, and once I'd uncovered it, other people had stepped up. Rebecca Chen had provided legal expertise. David and Jennifer had brought financial analysis skills. Maria had mobilized the community. Aaron had researched the law. Richard Kwan had provided crucial testimony. Dozens of neighbors had been willing to join the class action and cooperate with investigators. None of us could have done it alone. Together, we'd taken down people with more money, more connections, and more power than any of us individually possessed. That felt like a lesson worth remembering. As summer turned to fall, the story of Maple Ridge Estates became a case study. The Arizona Attorney General's office used it in presentations about HOA fraud. Consumer protection advocates cited it in arguments for stronger oversight of community associations. Rebecca Chen wrote an article for a law journal about using whistleblower protections and anti-SLAPP laws to enable residents to challenge HOA corruption. I was contacted by residents of other communities who noticed similar issues with their utility bills. I walked several of them through the process I'd used to investigate: how to access public records, how to compare city rates to what they were being charged, how to organize neighbors, when to involve lawyers and law enforcement. At least 2 other HOA fraud investigations in Arizona were launched based on similar patterns of utility billing schemes. It turned out that what Patricia Moreland had done wasn't unique. It was just one variation on a common theme: people in positions of trust using that trust to enrich themselves at others' expense. HOA boards, condo associations, property management companies. Anywhere you had a small group of people controlling money and making decisions for a larger group, you created opportunities for abuse. The solution wasn't to eliminate HOAs or community governance. It was transparency, accountability, and active participation by residents. It was people paying attention, asking questions, and being willing to challenge authority when something didn't seem right. In December, I was elected to the new HOA board of Maple Ridge Estates. I'd never had any interest in HOA politics before the water billing scandal, but people asked me to run, and I felt a responsibility to help ensure that nothing like the Moreland scheme could happen again. The work was tedious: reviewing budgets, evaluating landscaping contracts, dealing with architectural review requests. But I approached it with a commitment to the principles that had guided the fight against Patricia: transparency, documentation, and always asking, is this in the best interests of the community? We implemented systems that made it much harder for fraud to occur. All contracts had to be approved by a majority of the full board, with any conflicts of interest disclosed in writing, and the conflicted board member recused from the vote. All financial records were published monthly on the HOA website. We held quarterly town halls where any resident could ask questions about how their HOA dues were being spent. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements about rules and priorities. Some people thought we were too strict about architectural standards. Others thought we weren't strict enough. But there was a level of trust and engagement that hadn't existed before. People knew they could ask questions and get straight answers. They knew that their board members were acting in good faith. That, more than any legal victory or financial settlement, felt like the real accomplishment. By the time March 2027 rolled around, 2 years after I'd first noticed those discrepancies in the water bill, life in Maple Ridge Estates had stabilized into a new normal. The scandal was history, something people mentioned occasionally, but not the defining feature of the community. Property values, which had dipped slightly during the height of the publicity, had recovered. New families moved in, unaware of the drama that had preceded them. Patricia Moreland was in state prison, scheduled for her first parole hearing in 2030. Her house had been sold to help pay the restitution. Richard Moreland had moved out of state after serving his sentence. James Vickers had been disbarred and was reportedly working in his brother-in-law's insurance business in Tucson. I still lived in the same house, still worked the same job, still occasionally shared beers with Tom Hernandez while washing our cars on Saturday mornings. My daughter was 9 now, thriving in school, completely oblivious to the fact that her father had been at the center of a fraud investigation that had made the local news for months. Life was normal, except that I paid much closer attention to bills now. Every statement, every charge, every fee, I looked at them all with a critical eye. My wife joked that I'd become paranoid, but it wasn't paranoia. It was awareness. Because the truth was that frauds like the water billing scheme only worked when people didn't pay attention. They worked when people assumed that authority figures were trustworthy, that systems were fair, that if something seemed expensive it must just be the normal price. Most of the time those assumptions were probably correct, but not always. And the cost of not checking, of not asking questions, of not being willing to dig into something that didn't seem right, could be substantial. I'd found a nearly $1 million fraud because I'd spent a Tuesday evening actually looking at my water bill, instead of just paying it. That was all it had taken, looking, questioning, and then having the stubbornness to follow through when the answers didn't make sense. It was a lesson I'd carry for the rest of my life, and one I hoped to pass on to my daughter when she was old enough to understand it. Pay attention. Ask questions. Don't assume that people in positions of authority are acting in your best interests. And when something is wrong, speak up, even when it's uncomfortable or scary or likely to make you unpopular. Because sometimes, justice depends on ordinary people being willing to be a little bit difficult. On a warm evening in late March, I sat on my back patio with a beer, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in shades of orange and purple. My water bill for the month sat on the table beside me, $36.84, exactly what it should have been based on our usage and the city's rates. I smiled, took a sip of my beer, and thought about how far we'd come from that Tuesday night 2 years ago when I'd first started digging into the numbers. It had been worth it. Every stressful moment, every late night poring over documents, every confrontation, every appearance in court, all of it had been worth it. We'd won. Not just the lawsuit or the criminal case, but something more important. We'd proven that regular people could hold the powerful accountable. We'd shown that fraud, even fraud committed by well-connected people with resources and legal representation, couldn't stand up to sunlight and scrutiny, and we'd built a community in the process. The network of neighbors who'd fought alongside me had become genuine friends. We looked out for each other now, shared information, helped each other navigate the complexities of homeownership and community life. That was the unexpected gift of the whole experience, not just justice, but connection. In fighting a common enemy, we'd formed bonds that would probably last for years. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky faded from orange to deep blue, I heard my daughter calling me from inside the house. Dinner was ready. I picked up the water bill, gave it one last satisfied look at the reasonable number at the bottom, and headed inside to my family. The fight was over. We'd won. And life, mercifully, beautifully, was back to normal. Normal, except that now I knew what I was capable of when something needed to be challenged. Normal, except that I'd never again assume that the people in charge had my best interests at heart. Normal, except that I'd learned the power of ordinary citizens to investigate, organize, and demand accountability. Those lessons would stay with me forever. And maybe, if the need ever arose again, I'd be ready to use them. But for now, for tonight, I was just a husband and father sitting down to dinner with my family in a house in Scottsdale, Arizona, with a water bill that finally made sense.